What happens when a five-star general becomes so popular that he believes he can defy the President of the United States, reshape foreign policy on his own authority, and potentially drag the entire world into a third global conflict before the wounds of the second have even healed? This is not a hypothetical scenario from a political thriller, but the actual crisis that unfolded between President Harry S. Truman and General Douglas MacArthur in the spring of 1951, a confrontation that would test the very foundations of American democracy and civilian control of the military. The stage was set on the Korean Peninsula, where a United Nations police action had transformed into a brutal war involving Chinese forces, Soviet interests, and the terrifying possibility of nuclear escalation. MacArthur, the Supreme Commander who had accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri in September 1945 and ruled occupied Japan like a benevolent emperor, had become a figure of almost mythological stature in the American imagination. His trademark corncob pipe, aviator sunglasses, and dramatic pronouncements had made him more than a military leader. He had become a symbol of American power itself. Yet in the corridors of the White House and the Pentagon, a very different picture was emerging. One of a commander who had begun to see himself as accountable to history rather than to his constitutional superior. The collision between these two men would become one of the most significant constitutional crises in American history. If you're fascinated by the moments when powerful figures clash over the fate of nations, then subscribe to this channel right now because we're diving deep into stories that changed the course of history. Hit that like button to help others discover how close America came to a constitutional breakdown that could have altered the balance of power forever. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand why civilian control of the military matters. And leave a comment telling us what aspect of this crisis surprises you most, because the details of this confrontation are more shocking than most people realize. The relationship between Truman and MacArthur had always been complicated, rooted in mutual suspicion and vastly different worldviews. Truman, the plain-spoken former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, had never served as a high-ranking military officer and had ascended to the presidency only because of Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945. MacArthur, by contrast, was the son of a decorated Civil War general, had served with distinction in World War I, had been Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, and had commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater during World War II with a flair for dramatic public relations that made him a household name across America. The two men had met only once before the Korean crisis, on October 15, 1950, at Wake Island in the Pacific, a hastily arranged conference that was more about political optics than genuine strategic consultation. During that meeting, MacArthur had assured Truman that Chinese intervention in Korea was unlikely, and that the war would be over by Christmas, allowing American troops to return home in triumph. The general had arrived wearing his casual uniform and sunglasses, making no effort to render the customary salute to his commander-in-chief, a subtle but telling gesture of disrespect that Truman noted but did not publicly challenge. Within weeks of that meeting, everything MacArthur had predicted fell apart when on November 25, 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops stormed across the Yalu River into North Korea, smashing into American and UN forces in one of the most devastating military surprises in American history. The disaster transformed the Korean conflict from what seemed like a nearly won war into a desperate struggle for survival in brutal winter conditions. MacArthur's response to the Chinese intervention revealed the depth of his willingness to exceed his authority and redefine American strategy without approval from Washington. He immediately began publicly calling for an expansion of the war, demanding that the United States bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, and unleash Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan to open a second front against the communist mainland. These proposals horrified not just Truman and his advisors, but America's European allies who feared that such escalation would trigger Soviet intervention under the terms of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, signed in February 1950, potentially igniting World War III. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, including General Omar Bradley, General J. Lawton Collins, Admiral Forrest Sherman, and General Hoyt Vandenberg, were deeply skeptical of MacArthur's strategic vision, believing that a wider war with China would be the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, as Bradley would later famously testify. Truman's primary concern was maintaining the NATO alliance and containing Soviet expansion in Europe, where the real strategic threat to American interests lay. Korea, in Truman's view, was a limited conflict that required limited means, a test of American resolve, but not a cause worth risking global nuclear war. MacArthur, however, saw the conflict in apocalyptic terms as a civilizational struggle between Christianity and communism, between freedom and slavery, a battle that demanded total commitment and total victory regardless of the consequences. Throughout late 1950 and early 1951, the gap between Truman's policy of limited war and MacArthur's demands for escalation grew into an unbridgeable chasm. On December 6, 1950, Truman issued an explicit directive requiring all military commanders and diplomatic officials to clear public statements on foreign policy with the State Department, a direct response to MacArthur's increasingly inflammatory public pronouncements. The general essentially ignored this order, continuing to issue press releases, grant interviews, and send letters to sympathetic members of Congress that contradicted official administration policy. On March 7, 1951, MacArthur responded to a request from the Joint Chiefs for his views on a possible negotiated settlement by insisting that no peace could be made until the enemy was crushed, revealing his fundamental opposition to the limited war strategy. Then, on March 20, 1951, Truman authorized his State Department to draft a presidential statement offering to open negotiations with Chinese and North Korean forces, a carefully crafted diplomatic initiative designed to explore possibilities for ending the conflict. Before this statement could be issued, MacArthur learned of the plan, and on March 24, 1951, he released his own public statement that completely undermined the presidential initiative. In this extraordinary communiqué, MacArthur directly threatened China's military leadership, offered to personally meet with enemy commanders to discuss terms, and essentially dared the Chinese to extend the war, all without any authorization from Washington whatsoever. Truman later wrote in his memoirs that, when he read MacArthur's March 24th statement, he knew the general had to be relieved, that this was an act of insubordination so flagrant that it could not be tolerated. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had been working on the diplomatic initiative that MacArthur sabotaged, was furious, calling the general's statement a direct challenge to presidential authority. Secretary of Defense George Marshall, who had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II and was one of the most respected military figures in America, began to reluctantly agree that MacArthur had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Yet Truman hesitated, fully aware of the political firestorm that would erupt if he removed the most celebrated general in America from command. MacArthur's popularity with the Republican Party, particularly its conservative wing led by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, was immense. Republicans had been searching for issues to attack Truman's handling of foreign policy, particularly after the loss of China to communism in 1949 and the conviction of Alger Hiss for perjury in January 1950, events that had fueled charges that the administration was soft on communism. Firing MacArthur would hand the Republicans a powerful political weapon and could potentially cost Truman any chance of winning the 1952 presidential election. For nearly 2 weeks, the president wrestled with the decision, consulting with his closest advisors while MacArthur continued his public campaign for a wider war. The final straw came on April 5, 1951, when Republican Minority Leader Joseph Martin of Massachusetts read a letter from MacArthur on the floor of the House of Representatives. Martin had written to the general asking for his views on using nationalist Chinese troops in Korea, and MacArthur had responded with a letter dated March 20th that explicitly criticized Truman's limited war policy. In this letter, MacArthur wrote that there is no substitute for victory, and suggested that those who opposed expanding the war were playing into communist hands. The letter was a clear violation of Truman's December directive and represented open political warfare against the administration's foreign policy. When Truman read the text of the letter, he immediately called a meeting with Marshall, Acheson, and Averell Harriman, his special assistant for national security affairs. The four men reviewed the entire pattern of MacArthur's insubordination, his defiance of direct orders, his unauthorized policy statements, and his deliberate sabotage of diplomatic initiatives. Truman then consulted individually with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asking each one directly whether MacArthur should be relieved of command. All four chiefs, though with varying degrees of reluctance, agreed that the general had to be removed. General Bradley later testified that while the chiefs had deep respect for MacArthur's military abilities, they believed his continued defiance of presidential authority posed a threat to the constitutional principle of civilian control of the military. Right now, as you're learning about this pivotal moment in American history, take a second to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we bring you the stories that reveal how democracy survived its greatest tests. Like this video to make sure more people understand the constitutional principles that were at stake in this crisis. Share this with a friend, a family member, or a colleague who cares about leadership, accountability, and the balance of power, and drop a comment below telling us what you think Truman should have done differently, or what part of this story you never learned in school, because understanding this history is crucial to understanding America today. On the evening of April 10, 1951, Truman finalized his decision to relieve MacArthur of all his commands, including Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers in Japan, Commander-in-Chief of United Nations Command in Korea, and Commander-in-Chief of Far East Command. The president planned to announce the decision publicly on April 11th, giving MacArthur advance notice through official channels, so the general would learn of his dismissal through proper military protocol rather than through the press. However, on the night of April 10th, the Chicago Tribune, a newspaper fiercely opposed to Truman and sympathetic to MacArthur, got wind of the story and prepared to run it in their early morning edition. Learning of this leak, Truman was forced to move up his announcement. At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, the White House press secretary handed reporters a terse statement. With deep regret, I have concluded that General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and of the United Nations in matters pertaining to his official duties. In view of the specific responsibilities imposed upon me by the Constitution of the United States, and the added responsibility which has been entrusted to me by the United Nations, I have decided that I must make a change of command in the Far East. I have, therefore, relieved General MacArthur of his commands and have designated Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway as his successor. The announcement sent shockwaves across America and around the world. The public reaction was immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly hostile to Truman. Telegrams flooded the White House running 20-1 against the president's decision, with many using language that ranged from angry disappointment to outright calls for Truman's impeachment. Republican Senator William Jenner of Indiana declared on the Senate floor that this country today is in the hands of a secret inner coterie which is directed by agents of the Soviet Union, suggesting that Truman's decision was evidence of communist infiltration at the highest levels of government. Senator Richard Nixon of California, then a rising star in the Republican Party, accused the administration of appeasement and demanded congressional hearings. The Gallup poll conducted in late April showed that 69% of Americans disapproved of Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur, while only 29% supported it. MacArthur himself maintained public dignity in the immediate aftermath, issuing a statement that he would obey, as a good soldier, the orders of his commander-in-chief without public complaint. Yet behind the scenes, conservative Republicans were already planning to turn MacArthur's return to America into a political spectacle that would humiliate Truman and potentially launch the general as a presidential candidate for 1952. MacArthur departed Japan on April 16, 1951, leaving behind a country where he had wielded almost unlimited power for nearly 6 years, overseeing the transformation of Japan from a militaristic empire into a democratic nation under a new constitution that he had personally shaped. MacArthur arrived in San Francisco on April 17, 1951, receiving a hero's welcome from hundreds of thousands of cheering Americans who lined the streets. It was his first time on American soil in 14 years, having spent the entire period since 1937 in the Far East. The next day, April 19, 1951, he traveled to Washington to address a joint session of Congress, an honor rarely granted and one that symbolized the extraordinary political moment. In a speech that lasted 34 minutes and was interrupted by 30 ovations, MacArthur defended his conduct, argued for his strategic vision in Asia, and concluded with the famous lines borrowed from an old military ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye." The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric, delivered with MacArthur's characteristic dramatic flair, and it moved many in the chamber to tears. Representative Dewey Short of Missouri, a Truman critic, called it the voice of God, while others compared it to the Gettysburg Address. 3 days later, MacArthur traveled to New York City, where an estimated 7 million people turned out for a ticker-tape parade up Broadway, the largest such celebration in the city's history, exceeding even the welcomes given to Charles Lindbergh in 1927 and Dwight Eisenhower in 1945. Yet even as MacArthur basked in public adulation, the political and military establishment in Washington was preparing a systematic rebuttal. On May 3, 1951, the Senate Armed Services Committee and Foreign Relations Committee opened joint hearings to investigate MacArthur's dismissal and review American Far East policy. The hearings, which lasted for 7 weeks and produced over 2 million words of testimony, became a public forum for examining the fundamental questions at the heart of the crisis. Should America fight a limited war in Korea or expand the conflict to mainland China? Who should control military strategy? Generals in the field or civilian leaders in Washington? Was MacArthur a visionary leader who understood the communist threat, or an insubordinate commander who had violated the chain of command? MacArthur himself testified for 3 days, from May 3rd to May 5th, defending his actions and arguing passionately that his strategy of taking the war to China was the only path to victory. However, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified in the following weeks, they systematically dismantled MacArthur's strategic arguments. General Bradley delivered perhaps the most devastating assessment on May 15, 1951, when he told the committee that MacArthur's proposals would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, and that the real strategic threat remained the Soviet Union in Europe, not China in Asia. Secretary Marshall testified that MacArthur had repeatedly ignored or defied directives from Washington, and that such behavior could not be tolerated in a democracy. As the hearings progressed through May and into June 1951, public opinion began to shift. The detailed testimony revealed the extent of MacArthur's insubordination and the risks his proposed strategy posed to American interests. The general's support in opinion polls began to erode as Americans learned that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marshall, and even conservative figures like Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett all believed MacArthur had exceeded his authority. The specter of World War III, potentially fought with nuclear weapons, began to overshadow the emotional appeal of MacArthur's rhetoric. By the time the hearings concluded on June 25, 1951, the political momentum had shifted away from impeaching Truman and toward accepting that civilian control of the military was a principle that transcended any individual general's popularity. MacArthur, sensing that his political moment had passed, briefly allowed supporters to promote him as a potential Republican presidential candidate in 1952, but his campaign never gained serious traction. At the Republican National Convention in July 1952, MacArthur delivered the keynote address, but the nomination went to Dwight Eisenhower, his former subordinate in the Pacific during World War II, a choice that must have stung the proud general deeply. MacArthur spent the remaining years of his life in semi-retirement in New York City, occasionally making public speeches, serving on corporate boards, and watching as the world moved on without him. The Truman-MacArthur crisis ultimately reaffirmed one of the fundamental principles of American constitutional government, that military leaders, no matter how celebrated or accomplished, remain subordinate to civilian authority. The decision to relieve MacArthur of command took considerable courage from Truman, who knew it would damage him politically and potentially cost his party the White House in 1952, and indeed, Truman's approval ratings never recovered, contributing to his decision not to seek re-election. Yet history has largely vindicated Truman's choice, with most scholars recognizing that allowing a general to dictate foreign policy and strategy in defiance of presidential authority would have established a dangerous precedent that could have fundamentally altered the constitutional balance of power. The limited war strategy that MacArthur so vigorously opposed ultimately proved sound, as the Korean conflict was contained without expanding into a global war with China and the Soviet Union, and the armistice signed in July 1953 preserved South Korea as an independent nation, which was the original UN objective. MacArthur's vision of total victory through expanded war might have achieved a unified Korea under non-communist rule, but at what cost? The risk of Soviet intervention, nuclear escalation, and a Third World War fought across Asia and Europe was a price that Truman and his advisors rightly judged too high to pay. Before we close this story, take one final moment to subscribe to this channel if you believe understanding history is essential to making sense of the present. Like this video to help others discover why the clash between Truman and MacArthur still matters today in debates about presidential power, military authority, and foreign policy. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, whether they're a student of history, a veteran, a teacher, or just someone who cares about how democracies navigate crises. And leave a comment telling us what detail from this confrontation you found most revealing, what you think would have happened if Truman had backed down, or what lessons from 1951 apply to leadership challenges today, because your insights help build a community of people who learn from the past to better understand the future.